The ground was frozen already, and they had to work it with iron bars before the shovels would bite. He stood at the graveside in his grandfather's barn coat, too wide in the shoulders, too long in the sleeves, and watched the minister's breath make small clouds in the October air. 14 people came. The neighbors, the deacon, one man from the feed store in town who had driven out without being asked. Nobody from the bank. By 10 o'clock it was done. The rectangle of dark earth sat raw against the gray grass, and people said things to him that he nodded at and did not fully hear. Mrs. Eckstein, from a quarter-mile up the road, pressed his hand between both of hers and held it for a moment without saying anything. That he remembered. Then the cars backed out of the lane, one after another, and the gravel went quiet, and the farm was his. He did not go into the house. He walked straight across the yard to the laying barn, lifted the wooden latch, and went inside. The smell hit him first, warm grain dust and feather oil and something faintly sour, and then the sound, the low, constant murmur of 94 Rhode Island Reds shifting on their roosts. They did not startle at him. They had seen him in this barn his whole life. He stood in the center aisle and let his eyes go down the rows. The hens watched him with the mild, incurious attention of animals who have no opinion about grief. The barn was 60 feet long, timber-framed, built in 1921 by his grandfather's own hand. The boards had gone silver gray. There were gaps at the eaves, where the wind threaded through and moved the dust in slow spirals near the roof. He could feel the cold already, even in mid-October, coming up through the packed earth floor and through the spaces in the wall. He knew what that cold meant. He had heard about it his whole life, the years when the temperature dropped below 18 degrees and the hens went quiet and the egg count fell to nothing and the farm made no money from December through February. He had heard his grandfather talk about it at the kitchen table in a voice that carried the weight of something a man had accepted without understanding why. 38 acres, 94 hens, $210 owed to the First Farmers Bank in Platteville, due by the 1st of April. He was 18 years old. He had buried the only man who had ever shown him how to do this work. He stood there in the cold barn for a long time, long enough for the hens to lose interest in him entirely, long enough for the afternoon light through the high windows to go from gray to grayish-brown. Then he turned and walked back to the farmhouse to figure out what he had. He spent the first week learning the farm the way you learn a foreign language, badly, by mistake, and only fast enough to avoid the worst errors. The hens needed feeding before first light. He figured that out on day 2, when he arrived at the barn at 7:30 and found them restless and loud in a way that told him they had been waiting. He adjusted. The next morning he was there at 5:40 with a lantern and a bucket of laying mash from the Purina sacks stacked in the feed room. He did not know if 5:40 was right, but the hens settled, so he kept it. He collected eggs twice a day, morning and late afternoon, and kept count in a composition notebook he found in the kitchen drawer. October 14th, a Thursday, 61 eggs. October 15th, 58. October 16th, 63. The numbers weren't remarkable, but they were steady, and steady felt like something to hold on to. He hauled water from the hand pump near the barn door and refilled the drinking troughs every morning. He repaired a section of wire on the south run where something, a dog maybe, or a coyote, had pushed through the previous spring and nobody had fixed it properly. He oiled the hinges on the barn door that had been dragging and catching. Small things. The kind of things that pile up when a man is old and tired, and then pile up worse when a man is gone. On October 21st, a Wednesday, the sky turned the color of old tin around noon, and by evening he could smell the cold coming. A hard metallic smell that had nothing to do with autumn anymore. He brought extra water into the barn before dark, checked the roost boards, added straw along the base of the north wall where the draft came through the worst. It didn't matter. By morning of October 22nd, the thermometer he had nailed inside the barn door read 16 degrees. He stood there with the lantern and looked at it for a moment. 16 degrees. Below the number his grandfather had spoken about at the kitchen table with that particular voice, the voice of a man who has stopped expecting things to be different. The hens were on the roosts. They didn't come down when he opened the feed room. He scattered mash on the floor anyway. They looked at it. A few moved. Most did not. That morning he collected 4 eggs. The next morning, 2. The morning after that, none. He wrote the zeros in his composition notebook with the same pencil he had used for the 60s, and he looked at them for a while. 3 days. The numbers were still October. He hadn't even made it to November yet. The banknote was due April 1st. He had 94 hens that, at 16 degrees, were simply birds, eating feed he was paying for and giving him nothing back. He went inside and put water on the stove. Virgil Stander came up the drive on the morning of October 28th in his green International pickup, the one with the cracked passenger mirror he'd never replaced. Cal watched him from the barn doorway. The man walked the property the way a buyer walks it, slow, hands in his coat pockets, eyes moving from the fence line to the roof to the hen yard without hurrying. He was 54 years old and had farmed 120 acres next door for longer than Cal had been alive. He knew every soft board on this property. He'd probably known them before Elmer did. He stopped at the hen yard fence and looked at the birds for a while without saying anything. Then he said the cold had come early this year. Cal agreed that it had. Stander said he heard the laying had dropped off. Cal said it had slowed some. Stander nodded like that was the answer he'd expected and looked at the barn roof, the new tin on the east slope, the seams still bright against the older metal, and said that was a fine repair job, that roof. Cal thanked him. Then Stander said it. He said he'd take the laying hens off Cal's hands if it came to that. 94 birds, he said, was a lot of feed bill for a winter with no eggs coming. He said he'd give a fair price. Said it the way a man says something he's rehearsed on the drive over, and then he said that Elmer would have understood. That this wasn't failure, it was just arithmetic, that a boy Cal's age had his whole life ahead of him, and this particular farm wasn't the only road available. Cal looked at the fence post between them and didn't say anything. Stander waited a reasonable time, nodded, and drove back down the gravel. Cal fed the hens. He stood in the cold barn and listened to them move on the roosts, their small, shuffling weight on the pine, and he looked at the thermometer. 21 degrees. The mash sat mostly untouched. He counted the feed sacks remaining in the back room. 14. He did the arithmetic in his head and didn't like the number it arrived at. That evening he sat in the parlor with the lamp on and opened every drawer of the roll-top desk. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, something, maybe, that Elmer had left behind that said something other than what Stander had said. In the bottom left drawer, under a folded county road map and a seed catalog from 1949, his hand found a small notebook. Green cloth cover, water-stained brown on the back. No label. He opened it. The handwriting was his grandfather's, tight, careful, slanting slightly right. The first entry was dated March 3, 1921. He turned the lamp up a little and began to read. He started at the beginning and didn't rush it. The first entries were spare: a date, an outside temperature at first light, a count of eggs collected. March 3, 1921. 31 degrees, 62 eggs. March 4th. 28 degrees, 59 eggs. The handwriting was even and patient, the same pressure on every letter, the kind of script a man uses when he expects to be doing something for a long time. He read until the lamp needed trimming, then trimmed it and read more. The second evening, he brought a sheet of paper and a pencil to the desk. He started writing down numbers, not all of them, just the cold nights, the ones where the temperature dropped hard. He went through the entries year by year, pulling the data the way you'd pull nails from old lumber, carefully, one at a time, setting each one aside. By the third evening, he had 3 columns on the paper: date, temperature, eggs, 32 winters compressed onto a single sheet. He looked at it for a long time. The pattern was plain as a fence line, Above 20 degrees, the hens would give you something, not much, but something, a partial count, enough to matter. At 18 degrees, the numbers dropped towards 0. Below 18, they hit it. 0. Every time, in every year, without exception. 32 winters, and the old man had watched it happen 32 times, and he had written it down every single morning, and it had never once been different. The arithmetic was simple, and it was devastating. Grant County winters ran below 18 degrees for weeks at a stretch. Some years it happened in November. Most years, December through February. That was the income gone, the same as if the hens weren't there. He sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about the 14 feed sacks in the back room and the $210 owed to the bank on Court Street in Platteville by the 1st of April. He almost missed it. He was near the back of the notebook, past a section where the entries had grown shorter, just numbers, no notes, the handwriting unchanged but somehow tired, when the pages changed. The lined paper ended, and there were 2 unlined sheets folded and tucked against the inside back cover. He unfolded them carefully. The paper was thin and had browned at the folds. At the top, in pencil, January 9th, 1941. Below the date, a sketch. Not a drawing exactly, more like thinking done with a pencil, lines crossed out and redrawn, measurements written and then altered. He tilted the lamp closer. It showed the farmhouse from the side, then the distance to the barn, then a line running underground between them, drawn with small dashes, and beside it, in small cramped letters, clay tile, 8 in a netter, chimney base to barn floor center, residual only, no added fuel. He sat very still. He looked at the sketch for a long time without moving. He folded the papers back along their original creases and tucked them against the inside cover, the way he'd found them. Then he closed the notebook and set it on the desk beside the mason jar with the dried corn flour, and sat there for a while in the lamplight without doing anything at all. In the morning he did chores, fed the hens, broke the ice in the waterers, counted the eggs, 11, from 94 birds. Not good, not catastrophic, but not good. He wrote the number in the notebook, below the last entry in the old man's handwriting, and the act of writing in that space felt strange, like speaking in a room where someone older had always done the talking. On November 17th, he drove the truck into Millhaven, 7 miles of gravel, then 2 miles of county blacktop, the heater working just enough to keep the windshield clear. The Grant County Egg and Poultry Co-op sat on the south side of Main Street, a long, low building with a loading dock and a painted sign that had faded to near white on the west-facing side. He went in with a paper stating his name, the farm's acreage, and the flock count, 94 Rhode Island Reds, which he'd written out the night before at the kitchen table. The buyer was a thick-shouldered man in his 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He looked at the paper. He looked at Cal. He pulled a folder from a wire rack on the counter and opened it without hurry. He said the old man's account went back to 1934, 19 years. He said he had a lot of respect for that. Then he turned a page in the folder and ran his finger down a column and said the autumn numbers had been thin. October, thin. September, thin. He said thin autumn numbers usually meant thin winter numbers, and winter was when the co-op needed reliable volume most. Cal said the flock was intact, 94 birds, all laying age. The buyer nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is about to say something that is not agreement. He said he'd need to see consistent supply before he could formalize the account. He said bring in regular volume through December and they'd talk about reinstating in January. He said it without meanness. That was almost worse. He was not dismissing a boy, he was dismissing a set of numbers, and the boy just happened to be standing behind them. Cal drove home. The gravel road was dry and cold, and the truck rattled in the way it always rattled, and the fields on either side were bare and brown under a white sky. He thought about the sketch in the notebook. He thought about January 9th, 1941, 12 years before he was old enough to do anything about it, and a line drawn underground in pencil that had never become anything more than a line. He turned down the farm road, and the barn came into view. December came in, like something that had been waiting. The first hard freeze hit on a Tuesday, the 2nd of the month, and by the following weekend, the thermometer outside the barn door was reading 11 degrees at mid-morning. Not 11 at night, 11 when the sun was up and the sky was the flat white of old tin. The hens felt it before the mercury did. He noticed it in the way they moved, or stopped moving, pressing together along the roost boards, their feathers puffed out, their heads pulled down into that tight, hunkered posture that meant the body was choosing warmth over everything else, including laying. He collected eggs morning and evening. The numbers told the story plainly. The first week of December, he averaged 31 eggs a day. The second week, 19. By the third week, when the temperature dropped below 15 and stayed there for 6 days running, the daily count was 4 eggs one morning, 3 the next, and then 2 days of nothing at all. 94 hens. 94 birds eating scratch and drinking water he had to break ice from twice a day, and the barn was producing less than a single family's breakfast. He did the arithmetic the way his grandfather had probably done it, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp pulled close, a stub of pencil and the back of a used envelope. The co-op account was suspended. No account meant no sales through the co-op, and without the co-op he had no buyer for volume. He could sell a few dozen at the Millhaven feed store on consignment, maybe $2 a week if he was lucky, and the shelf wasn't already full. $2 a week was not a number. It was an insult the situation was offering him. The note at First Farmers Bank on Court Street in Platteville was $210, due April 1st. That was not a flexible date. Banks in Grant County in the winter of 1953 did not extend notes for boys who had inherited failing farms. He knew that without asking. He opened the green notebook again. January 9th, 1941. The sketch filled the lower half of the page. His grandfather's pencil lines careful and slightly crooked, the way a man draws when he is thinking out loud. The clay tile flue running lateral from the chimney base, sloping gently downward, then leveling under the frost line, then terminating beneath the center of the barn floor. No additional fuel, no new stove. Just the heat already leaving the farmhouse chimney, already dissipating into cold ground, redirected instead, through packed earth and clay tile, into the space where 94 birds were slowly going cold. He set the notebook flat on the desk and held it open with his palm. 12 years this sketch had been sitting in this drawer. He studied the angle of the slope. He studied the depth notation his grandfather had written in the margin, 3 feet minimum, 4 preferred. He made the decision on January 3rd, a Sunday, before the sun came up. Not dramatically, no moment of resolve, no deep breath in the kitchen doorway. He simply looked at the sketch one more time, looked at the date his grandfather had written it, 12 years and 23 days ago, and decided that the thing was going to get built. He folded the notebook closed, set it back on the desk beside the mason jar, and went to feed the hens. They were huddled in the near corner of the laying barn, pressed together under the one working heat lamp, which ran off a 50-foot extension cord plugged into the farmhouse wall. The thermometer nailed to the center post read 22 degrees. He counted eggs without expecting much, 9. From 94 birds. He carried them back to the house in his jacket pocket and sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil. He needed clay drain tile, 4-inch, unglazed, the old agricultural kind, the sort that had been going into Wisconsin fields since before his grandfather broke this ground. New tile from the Millhaven Hardware and Supply ran 22 cents a foot. He had calculated the run at roughly 48 feet, 11 feet from the chimney base to the property line of the barnyard, then across 37 feet of frozen earth to the center of the barn floor. 48 feet at 22 cents was $10.56 he did not have. But he had heard something in November from a man named Grover Pelch who sold feed out of a converted garage on Route 35, that the old Dennehy place east of B-Town, 8 miles out, had been condemned and partly knocked down the previous summer, and that the drain tile system in the east field had been dug up and left in a pile when the county cleared the outbuildings. Grover hadn't known if anyone had claimed it. He drove out on January 4th, a Monday, in the dark before first light, the 1946 Ford tractor pulling the flatbed wagon. The road east of B-Town was ice-packed and rutted, and the tractor's headlamps threw thin yellow cones against the black tree line. He found the Dennehy property by the outline of a collapsed granary against the sky. The tile pile was exactly where Grover had said, stacked in loose disorder in the east field, half buried under a skim of snow. He dug the first section out with his boot heel. It took him 3 trips that day, and 1 the next, to load what he needed. The tile was intact, most of it. Old 4-inch clay, clean fractures on a few sections he set aside. He stacked it along the south wall of the laying barn, piece by piece, in the January cold, until he had 56 feet accounted for. Nobody had claimed it. He left $2 in an envelope in the ruins of the Dennehy mailbox anyway. Then he went home and looked at the sketch again, because now the ground had to be broken. The ground east of the barn had been frozen since the second week of December, and by January it was iron. He started on the 9th, a Saturday, with the spade and the mattock his grandfather had left hanging on the barn's south wall. The mattock had a split handle wrapped in baling wire that bit into his palm. He swung it anyway. The trench had to run 41 feet from the chimney base to the barn's center floor. He had measured it twice with a cloth tape, marked the line with a length of twine staked at each end, and calculated the drop. Shallow, just enough grade to settle the tiles level. The first foot of earth came up in chunks like broken crockery. Below that it turned to something closer to stone. He worked 4 hours the first morning and opened 8 feet. His shoulders ached in a way that felt structural, like something inside the joint was being slowly separated. He ate cold biscuits at noon, sitting on the edge of the trench with his feet dangling, and then he went back down. By the morning of the 11th, a Monday, he had 22 feet open. The trench was 3 feet deep along most of its length, shallower near the chimney end where the ground sloped. His gloves had worn through at the right index finger and along the heel of the left hand. He had wrapped both with strips of flannel cut from an old shirt, and the flannel had soaked through before the first hour was done. He didn't notice her coming up the lane. She was 72 steps away before he looked up, and by then she was already watching him. 67 years old, a dark wool coat, a tin bucket in one hand. She stopped at the edge of the trench and looked down at him without speaking for a moment. Just looked, the way a person looks when they've been imagining something for a long time and are now checking it against what's actually there. She set the tin bucket on the frozen ground, unscrewed the lid, and he smelled coffee. He climbed out. His hands were bleeding where the flannel had shifted at the heel. She poured. She handed it up. Then she said, "I watched your grandfather draw that sketch. He drew it at my kitchen table in January of 1941. A Sunday afternoon. He had the notebook open on the oilcloth and he was working it out in pencil, rubbing and redrawing. He asked me if I thought it would hold heat through the floor. I told him I didn't know enough about it to say." She looked at the trench. "He had those tile sections laid along the south wall by the winter of 42, she said. But that spring the money went somewhere else, and then it always went somewhere else after that." She didn't say anything more. She poured herself the second cup and stood there with him in the cold, watching the trench. Nora left before the light changed. He watched her cross the road, the empty tin bucket swinging at her side, until she was through her gate and gone. He worked another 2 hours before his hands made him stop. That night, he wrapped them in strips of old flannel and lay in the dark listening to the wood stove knock and settle. The trench was 40 feet long now. He needed 12 more. He was back out by 7 the next morning. By the 19th of January, the trench was finished to within 4 feet of the barn foundation, the clay tiles laid end to end along the bottom, packed with a thin bed of sand he'd carried from the creek bank in a grain sack over 4 successive mornings. The last section, the entry through the foundation and the joint at the chimney base, was the work he had been saving. It required the most precision, and he had wanted the rest right before he attempted it. He was measuring the foundation clearance when he heard the truck. He didn't look up until the door had already shut. He knew the walk, that particular combination of weight and self-assurance that covered ground like a man who owned it. Virgil Stander stood at the edge of the trench and looked down the length of it for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "Your grandfather tried a dozen things, boy. Stove pipe through the west wall, a coal insert, before coal got dear, extra bodies. He bought up a flock of 40 barred rocks thinking the body heat would carry. None of it held." Cal straightened up. He held the measuring tape in one hand, the end pin in the other. Virgil was looking at the tile work now, following the line of it back toward the house. He said, "You're running this under the floor?" Cal didn't answer. Virgil pushed his hat up with one thumb the way he did and looked at the farmhouse chimney base, working it out. He was not a stupid man, and that was part of the problem. He would eventually understand it, and Cal would have to watch him understand it, and still it would not change anything he had said. Virgil said, "Could work." His voice had shifted very slightly. "Could also heave when the ground moves in March." Cal looked at the trench. He had packed the bed 2 inches deep and tamped it with a fence post. The tiles were snug. He had measured the slope himself with a line level borrowed from Elmer's toolboard. He said, "I know." That was all he said. Virgil looked at him the way a man looks when he is trying to decide if quiet is ignorance or something else. He stood there another moment. Then he walked back to the truck and drove north. Cal went back to his measuring. He finished the backfill on February 6th, a Saturday, working by lantern light until past 8 in the evening, because the ground was starting to stiffen again and he wanted the trench closed before it froze solid. He tamped the last section with the fence post and then knelt and pressed both palms flat against the earth. Nothing yet, just cold dirt and the smell of clay. The connection at the chimney base had taken most of February 5th. The flue collar Elmer had drawn in the sketch was a simple clay sleeve joint, mortared tight, seated into the footing where the chimney met the ground. Cal had chipped the opening himself with a cold chisel and a 2-pound hammer, working in half-hour stretches because the vibration traveled up into the chimney column and he didn't want to crack the flue liner higher up. He fitted the collar, packed it with stove mortar borrowed from the hardware bin in the barn, and let it cure overnight with a low fire in the box. February 8th was a Sunday. The temperature dropped through the afternoon, and by dark, the thermometer on the barn door read 12 degrees Fahrenheit. He stoked the wood stove to its full draw, not a roaring fire, just a deep, sustained burn, the kind that holds coals for 6 hours, and went to bed without checking the barn. He had learned something about waiting. The ground needed time to move the heat. Checking at midnight would only tell him what he already knew. He was up at 4:30. He pulled on his grandfather's barn coat in the dark kitchen and did not light the lamp. He went outside. The cold hit him across the face like a board, and the stars were absolutely still. He walked to the barn, lifted the latch, stepped in. It was not warm. He had not expected warm. But it was 39 degrees at the center of the floor. He measured it with the glass thermometer he'd hung at knee height from the center post, the same post where Elmer had hung it for 32 winters, the nail hole worn wide and dark. 39 degrees. The hens were already moving on the roosts, low talk running through them, the way they sounded when the light was right and the temperature was right, and something in their bodies said yes. He stood in the center of the barn and he did not move for a long time. By the time full light came through the east window, every one of the 94 hens had laid. He went through each box. He counted 94 eggs, not a single nest empty. He stood at the barn door with the egg basket in both hands and looked back down the length of the floor, at the packed earth above the tile, at the hens already settling back onto their roosts, unhurried, as if the cold had simply stopped being a fact. February came in without ceremony. The temperature dropped to 4 above on the 6th, then climbed, then dropped again to single digits on the 14th, and held there for 5 days. Each morning he went to the barn before light and read the thermometer at knee height on the center post. 38, 41, 39. The numbers stayed inside the range the hens needed. Not comfortable, not warm the way a house is warm, but enough. Enough was all it had ever needed to be. The hens laid every day. He kept the numbers in the notebook the same way his grandfather had, 1 line per day, the date, the overnight low, the barn temperature at dawn, the count. February 6th, outside 4 degrees, barn floor 38, 92 eggs. February 14th, outside 2 degrees, barn floor 39, 94 eggs. He wrote each entry in pencil, careful and small, the same column widths the old man had used. The page filled slowly. He did not skip a day. By the last week of February, he had more eggs than he could deliver. The account at the co-op was still suspended. He had nowhere to sell. So he held them, turned the cellar-cold room into a makeshift cooler, stacking the crates on the stone shelf where his grandfather had kept salt pork, checking them twice a day, rotating the oldest to the front. He could not hold them forever, but he had until the cold broke. He had a little time. March came on a Tuesday that year, gray and windless, the fields still locked under a skin of old snow. He did his arithmetic. Across the 3 days since the last delivery he had managed to place through a neighbor's account as a favor, February 28th, March 1st, March 2nd, the surplus had built to 47 dozen. 47 dozen eggs, stacked in the cellar, waiting. He set his alarm for 4 in the morning on the 4th, a Thursday. He was up before it sounded. He dressed in the dark, pulled on his grandfather's barn coat, and went out to the shed. The 1946 Ford tractor started on the 3rd pull. It always took 3 in cold weather, something about the carburetor he hadn't found a fix for yet. He backed it to the wagon, hooked the hitch by lantern light, then carried the crates from the cellar one by one and loaded them into the wagon bed, setting each crate flat and snug against the next so nothing would shift on the dirt road. 47 dozen. He counted the crates twice in the lantern light, standing in the dark yard with his breath coming in short white clouds. 7 miles to Millhaven. The co-op opened at 6:30. He climbed onto the tractor seat, killed the lantern, and pulled out of the yard before dawn had even begun to think about arriving. The road into Millhaven was empty at that hour. Just the tractor's headlamp cutting through the dark, and the frozen ruts pulling at the wheels, and the wagon swaying gently behind him. He kept his speed down. 47 dozen eggs do not forgive a pothole taken too fast. The co-op dock light was already on when he turned into the lot at 6:15. A man in a canvas apron stepped out from the loading bay, and it took him a moment, standing in the yellow dock light, hands in his pockets, before he recognized the boy on the tractor. He didn't say anything at first. He walked to the wagon and looked at the crates, and then he began to count. He counted them twice. The boy sat on the tractor seat and did not offer anything. When the man was done, he straightened up, put his hands back in his pockets, and looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he named a price. It was a fair price, not generous, but fair, the same rate the established accounts received. He said the account would be reinstated as of that morning. He said he'd expect regular volume going forward. The boy nodded. He climbed down and helped carry the crates inside. He drove home in the early light, the sky going from black to gray to a pale, tired blue along the tree line. The fields on either side of the road were still white, but there was something softer about the light, the way it lay across the snow without the hard glare of deep winter. He noticed it and said nothing about it, even to himself. Back at the farm, He unhitched the wagon, put the tractor away, and went inside. The wood stove in the kitchen had held overnight. He didn't build it up. He walked through the parlor to the roll-top desk and sat down in his grandfather's chair. The green notebook was where he always left it now, in the center of the desk. He opened it to the last written page. October 2nd, 1953. His grandfather's hand, thin and careful. Temp 31 degrees Fahrenheit at barn.6 DZ. Hens slow but holding. Below that, 32 years of blank paper. He uncapped the pen and wrote one line. Barn held 42 degrees Fahrenheit on the coldest night yet. The hens didn't miss a day. CH, March 4th, 1954. He capped the pen. He set the notebook beside the mason jar on the corner of the desk, the jar holding a single dried cornflower, the same one that had been there since October, the same one he had never moved. He sat for a while in the quiet. Outside, the hens were already at it. He could hear them through the wall, low, steady, unhurried. The barn was warm. The work was not finished, but it was begun, and it was his, and it was enough.